I think infoxication was the one that we heard recently that I really liked. I think it's a great way of doing this. The obvious one is like snake oil and hype and, those kind of things. It all kind of gets mixed in, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we could also revert to normal words like BS and lies and all these layers of sophistication for something that is so fundamental.
Yeah, exactly.
BS is good. BS is good, yeah.
Welcome to the Healthusiasm Podcast, a panel discussion on innovations in health and self-care. My name is Christophe Jauquet. I'm a health business expert, author, and professional keynote speaker. Every week, I discuss with a panel of experts the positive changes that are shaping our health and happiness. And for this discussion, we have two of your beloved experts in the panel. From Scotland, but living near Brighton, medical expert in digital innovation, Dr. Keith Grimes.
Sit like Aldi.
From Ghent, Belgium, human experience expert Mo Zouina.
Een hele goede dag gewenst.
So we're missing out on our digital health connector from Barcelona, Aline Noizet. So I think normally we talk about health enthusiasms, health innovations. We've been doing that for the past couple of months, but for this session, we will go back to something we've done in the past, which is it something, nothing, or everything? More specifically, we will be talking about infodemics, infoxication, health toxification, health washing, medi-myths, quack storms, biofiction, wellness wonkeries, or in other words, misinformation or disinformation in health. These are the words that I found related to our topic. Do you know any other ones, guys?
I think infoxication was the one that we heard recently that I really liked. I think it's a great way of doing this. The obvious one is like snake oil and hype and, those kind of things. It all kind of gets mixed in, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we could also revert to normal words like BS and lies and all these layers of sophistication for something that is so fundamental.
Yeah, exactly.
BS is good. BS is good, yeah.
So we will be talking about BS, but more specifically, we will be talking about misinformation and disinformation. And there is a difference indeed. I'd like to start with explaining the difference. Misinformation, as defined by WHO, is the spread of inaccurate or false information, regardless of the intent to mislead. Disinformation, on the other hand, is the intentional spread of false or doubtful information, with the specific aim to deceive or manipulate. And I have to say it's been a topic in our WhatsApp group for quite a while. There's often articles shared there, but it's also been already on the podcast in some form or another. In multiple episodes, actually, we talked about the misinformation or the disinformation. But I think specifically in episode 7, we talked about medfluencers and healthtertainment. Mm-hmm. Two topics that are very close to misinformation and disinformation. But I think that this topic is super relevant. I was referring to the WhatsApp group that we have and with the expert panel here. And one of the recent links that was shared was related to the Diary of a CEO. You might have heard of that podcast. It's the most downloaded podcast in the UK, has surpassed 1 billion streams, and it is hosted by Stephen Bartlett. And very remarkably, in the past 18 months, Bartlett has focused more on health. I always say that health is super popular. Every business is a health business. All businesses are focusing on health because people are so much interested in health. Well, that also happened with his podcast. And so in between April and November 2023, Bartlett already released 23 health-related episodes. And now he has a claim that he brings all these so-called experts onto his podcast to attract a lot of listeners. But of these 23 health-related episodes, 15 of these episodes contained potentially harmful health claims. We're talking things related to cancer treatment, things related to COVID, obviously. Cancer treatment was this guy, Dr. Thomas Seyfried, who said that ketogenic diet could treat cancer, even sometimes saying that you need to forget about maybe conventional treatments if you do a proper ketogenic diet. So these kind of things often pop up in regular media and even in one of the most popular podcasts in Europe. But of course, it's not just a podcast, because disinformation and misinformation is becoming more relevant than ever. And, if you look at some of the more recent announcements are very worrisome. And none the least in the light of Trump 2.0 era that we are entering it right now, the newest president, or should I say CEO of the United States. Because what have we seen in the recent weeks is Meta announcing that they would stop fact-checking on their social media platforms. Instead, they would be replacing it with user-added community notes, a bit similar to what X is doing. But also in that same category of the Trump 2.0 era, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will be leading the Department of Health and Human Services. And also here I think it's a very interesting event that is happening, because the person is very famous for his very questionable health claims. And I have a couple of them here. I mean, this future to be or soon to be head of Department of Health and Human Services once said that Lyme disease is highly likely a military engineered bioweapon. He also said that environmental toxins like pesticides are linked to gender identity in children. Or he said that antidepressant drugs may be as addictive as heroin. And he speaks really from experience, because he was a heroin user for more than a decade in his youth. So this is the new head of Department of Health in the United States, having spread quite some, mis and disinformation over time. So this is the situation. This is the reality that we are living in today. And this is the topic that we will bring forward in this podcast. Dr. Keats, as a doctor hearing all these things happening, you must have some feelings. Beyond feelings, probably a lot of thoughts and reflections on it, but you definitely have some feelings on that topic as well, right?
Yes, I certainly do. And this is one of those situations where I have to battle my feelings taking control of the steering wheel, because, working as a doctor, trying to be in a position of trust, trying to identify what are factual and truthful things and using them to help patients, how we communicate is very, very important. And I've been through, over the years, many different versions of this. The first time I came across this was Andrew Wakefield and the vaccines and MMR potentially being linked to autism, something that has been roundly disproved, yet caused untold headaches and problems that we're still getting back from. So yes, it's quite close to my heart. And I think where we are just now in the world is, as social media becomes a bigger part of our life, and as the algorithms that drive social media tune into the things that motivate us deeply, how we feel and our emotions, everything is turned up a notch. And then you sprinkle some AI on this as well, and before you know it, the stakes are raised. And what we've said, or what you just said about, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a worry. It's a worry for a bunch of reasons. America is an important place for the world. It's important for the Americans as well, of course. And the position of being the sort of head of the Health and Human Services in the US has enormous impact on not only the Americans, but the rest of the world. And so, yeah, you already picked up on some of those things. I picked up on some of these lists as well. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has previously said and put his name behind the fact that vaccines cause autism. They don't. COVID was bioengineered to target Caucasians and Black people. No evidence of that. HIV does not cause AIDS. Antidepressant use increases school shootings. Wi-Fi causes brain tumors. And the FDA is suppressing health advancements, all of which are contrary to all the evidence. And these are things that he's currently being grilled, for this position in the US right now and being asked to talk about this. How much of this is him not understanding or truly believing these things and spreading it, or how much of it is disinformation? Because this week we've seen in these Senate hearings about the confirmation asking him to declare and say that he would not benefit from his investments in companies that directly seek to find people who have been harmed or feel they've been harmed by vaccines and take legal action. So it's a very heady brew. going into the fact that this is the person that will help determine exactly how information is shared and how science is conducted. And then you add on top of that the decisions that happen with the executive orders from Trump. You know, in the first few days, this storm of things. They have pulled out of the WHO. They have freezed HHS regulation and communications. You know, they've rescinded many of the COVID-19 pandemic broad executive orders that are there not only to do with what happened with COVID, but also what happens next. Things like workplace safety have been drawn back, you know. So how do I feel about it? I feel quite strongly. Let's see how things go. But, you know, there's a little bit more fuel on this fire right now. And I think it's a really good time to be talking about it.
Yeah, most definitely. And just to piggyback on something that you said literally social media has taken a bigger part of our life. I think 2025 will be the year where more people are on social media than watching television. So it's the first time that we have more people actually being more on social media than watching TV, which I thought was already happened in the past 5-6 years ago, but it's happening right now. And this changes, of course, a lot of the dynamic of the information that is circulating in our world. Mo, I want to chime in here on feelings and thoughts.
It's not. I don't get the impression that television was better in terms of being unbiased.
Possibly not. Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure that this is a regression, but what I see is the intensity that comes with a stance or a standpoint or an opinion. You know, we've all been there. We're just sitting quietly at the table with family members, and then an uncle says something, you know, my turmeric latte has cured my cancer. And then someone looks it up, and then things, and before you know it, you're in a debate and a battleground. And there's two things. There's a battleground, but it's about health, which is interesting because that kind of proves your point, Christophe, in terms of aspiration and the importance of health.
Mm.
And I was thinking, how come information and stances have become so important? And why is it happening on health? And why is health a kind of a currency of status? And I thought that there were maybe some dynamics, you know, kind of an underflow feeding into that. And I think the decline in real social interaction means that we see each other less, and for less time means that there's less time for nuance, right? We need to make our point faster. We need some interesting hooks, almost like clickbait, right? We just take a stance, and then, you know, and as you say, you know, there is a lack of depth. There is a lack of us having skills to debate and really listen to the other. And why is he or she thinking that? But we also know, and what's interesting and what might be alarming, piggybacking on what you said, Christophe, is that it is proven that heavy use of social media is linked to lower critical thinking, right? That's Computers and Human Behaviors, as a study from 2018. So the more our debates become superficial, the more we feel we need to take a polarized stand, because otherwise we disappear. And here is the second part, and that's the erosion of identity. We are evolving more and more.
Can I piggyback on on what you said?
Go ahead.
Before you go into the second part, maybe, because you said, is television worse than social media? It's a fair debate, and I'm not quite sure if I had the answer, but if I listen to the rest of your reasoning, the fact that we have shorter debates, first of all, the discussion that we had in families are now online and in bigger audiences, and people use it to profile themselves. Yeah. They look for confirmation by others, which in a small group then that is maybe in the living room, you might not easily find it. And so I think social media is making sure that your thoughts are heard, and you'll definitely find people with the same stupid ideas perhaps than yourself. So I think in that regard, social media might be worse. Another reason why social media might be worse, I think, is the fact you also said it's clickbait, it's short debate. It's hard to put big argumentation on social medias. But I think that's also, the laziness you always talk about. People are very lazy. It's easier to go along with a short argument that sounds familiar or similar to the one that you just put out, than to actually open your mind, reflect upon the opposite idea, and see where maybe in the middle ground there might be some truth. we're really in, and social media hasn't reinforced that. So I really think to answer the question, or the maybe not answer the question, but to reflect upon whether television is worse than social media, I think social media might be worse in that regard. It's easier to just go along with the ones that share that same opinion.
Yeah, I think there's two ways. I'll just go back on that. So the effort to interact on social media is typing, or just a voice message or anything else, but it's way shorter than a live debate. And we are missing a channel, which is the human factor, looking at people. So taking a stance from a distance is kind of easy, and we often add that intensity to that. And then secondly, we are serviced on our stance by the algorithm. So it's true that these echo chambers, if there were no social media, it would be hard for me to find someone that thinks like me. I would have to look it up somewhere, or I would have to be in a community where I find that. So finding someone who agrees with me is kind of easier, which makes me kind of fixed on my position.
Yeah, and behind your screen, it's easier to be a little bit more bold and aggressive, even, right, Keith?
Yeah, it's that keyboard warrior thing, isn't it? There's so many factors, and actually coming back to what you were saying, Mo, about television and radio and newspapers all had the same problem. There were means by which you could spread information, misinformation or disinformation at scale. I think the principal difference, and you mentioned some of them, the other one is that, if television was like a megaphone, social media is giving everyone megaphones. It's the scale, isn't it? It's the fact that it's effortless to create this. Now, that doesn't mean that you reach everyone, but then when you put on top of it how algorithms work and incentivize things that promote, algorithms aren't there with a malign influence. They react to what they're being rewarded for. And if you design them to reward interaction, and if interaction is driven by our emotional response, you will naturally have things that drive an emotional response in front of you, and then you respond emotionally, and then so the wheel turns. One of the terms, we were talking about terms at the start, and there was one that maybe is longer standing, but I certainly discovered it as I was looking into this. We're all aware of social determinants of health. But then there's a couple of articles in the Lancet that talked about emotional determinants of health. And I thought that was very, very helpful, because it's obvious, that how we feel in general, but how we feel about the things that we do will determine the actions that we take. And it was talking about the emotional determinants of health being very much highlighted in COVID, when there was a great deal of anxiety, fear of the unknown. And so a natural sense to be driven towards certainty and comfort and hope, and maybe a sense that expert opinion has led us into the wrong place or curtailed our freedoms. And so you will look to be more open to other opinions too. But I'm definitely going to incorporate that into my thinking from now on. I spoke to my wife about it beforehand and said, isn't this a great thing? And she works in, the provision of care for, not clinical care, but sort of more holistic care. And she just sort of smiled at me and went, what am I always saying? Of course, it's how people feel about this. So I felt a bit foolish. But sometimes having a like a scientific term to it gives groups, people like me, you think more in my head, to kind of access that. So I think that's a part of it as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think, first of all, how people feel about it. So the first one was decline in social interaction. And then secondly, social interaction. We don't have communities anymore where we kind of meet, church, whatever. There's a nice book. It's called Bowling Alone. You need to look up that talks about that. And then secondly is the erosion of identity. We, especially in the Western world, we are evolving towards a hyper individualistic society and hyper individualistic. The American dream is I can do whatever I want to, but it's not about the community. If you, for instance, compare that to Asia, right? If you have an Asian look at a painting, they will kind of see the big picture. If you have an American look at a painting, they see the individual, which is highlighted. So that hyper individualization is very important. There's declining group activity. And what you see is, as that identity is eroding, people are uncertain about, most people who are uncertain about identity overcompensate online, often these keyboard warriors. But then secondly, we are also talking about science. And I heard an ambassador of the United Nations saying, what is strange is that science has just become a voice in the room. just like everyone's else opinion. And the ethics of science is a business. Let's be honest. We look at science as something that is unbiased, irrefutable, and things like that. But we also need to acknowledge that science is a business. A lot of the research things in university are sponsored in a way to go towards a certain direction. They benefit from the research if they can find something and things like that. So maybe that's also really interesting. The trust in science itself is also kind of eroding because we've seen and we know, we've all worked for pharmaceutical companies. Clinical trials are engineered to show efficacy. So I think it's also something that, no one does just fundamental research for the sake of fundamental research. There's always something fueling it. We looked at Coca-Cola and Christophe, they're not all like that. But the fact that some of them, were disclosed in some way. Coca-Cola sponsored the shift in the narrative scientifically from sugar to calories, right? So that's one thing where I think this is kind of the Overton window. I don't know if you're familiar with that. The Overton window is that I think Stephen Bartlett is showing things that not only are successful, but are also able to be so far off that they're able to shift the discussion from an inertia in the scientific community to something that is more acceptable, and that they're also open and curious about, could it be, right? It's not because my partner, she's a holistic doctor and she has seen things happen in her practice. And I think we also need to stimulate science to be curious. What if it were like that? And there's a nice sentence, and maybe you'll be offended, Keith, but absence of proof isn't proof of absence.
Oh no,
Right?
I accept that, but I'm just going to say that is science. It's
But my impression of science is, science is eroding in such itself that they're grabbing on to whatever. And I was just flabbergasted this week when I learned that gravity might not be a fundamental force of the universe. That gravity is not present in each element, but gravity exists by the interaction of element at a quantum level. Right? So my brain was in overload. It was 404 error. This does not compute. And I said, how nice to be thinking these things for decades, for centuries, and then having someone to say, maybe gravity isn't a fundamental force of the universe, and maybe it just exists from an interaction between tiny elements. So anyways, this is kind of the narrative. Is the first is the decline in social interaction isn't helping this. Secondly, the erosion of identity, the hyper individualistic part, is making us take stances because it gives us a level of superiority. It gives us a level of identity. The overload of data doesn't help science too, because it gives several angles to the same stance, right? You could prove that A is true. You could prove that B is true because we have so much data. And then we need to acknowledge that science in itself is a business, and we need maybe to challenge science to be more curious and open to some scenarios that might be true, and maybe they need to refute it or things like that. So I think that's my practical advice. I think curiosity, open-mindedness is something that would help us in the future, because otherwise I think we are evolving towards a very dystopian future.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fair point. And actually, so if I sort of dwell more on the science side and my own life journey about, when I started out as a doctor, I was very much involved in the skeptic movement, cleaving very strongly to evidence base. And I was incredibly dismissive about certain beliefs. And I still hold to the evidence, but over time I've changed, because in part, as life goes on, you see things that you start to be better, I think, at understanding the limits of your knowledge and the fact that things that you hold very firmly to can change. My example, going into the pandemic, the evidence and the science was very clear. Masks did not help. That was the commonly held stance, right at the start. And even I was online when people were saying, oh, we should be starting to wear masks. I was like, no, that doesn't, it only works in certain circumstances. It doesn't help. And then, of course, as some science comes out, I had to sort of think about it and change my position. Ideally, we all have to be ready to change as the evidence changes, and be humble and consider the edges of our thought. What was interesting, though, is that whilst I was reasonably comfortable, apart from feeling a bit embarrassed that I changed my position on that, was some people would look at that and say, how on earth can you live with yourself? You're a hypocrite. You said this and you said the other side. And I think we need to maybe do a better job as well of instilling the ability to be critical. We come back to that. The ability that the facts may change or maybe be slightly more nuanced. But in a world where everything is being whipped to reward taking a strong position and identifying yourself as being with that position, yeah, the stakes get higher where we are right now. And how we kind of calm it down a bit, I don't quite know.
Yeah, I think Neil deGrasse Tyson, you like him or you don't, but said it interestingly. He said, the challenge of our era is knowing enough to think you're right, but not knowing enough to know you're wrong.
But that is changing, though. That is changing. I think if we think about AI, I think one of the reasons why we've seen in the past 20 years this interest and this growth in health information, whether it's correct information, disinformation, or misinformation, is because health information until 20 years ago, 25 years ago, was completely not equally distributed. Right? It was the healthcare industry, the people, the healthcare providers mainly, who had all the information, and patients hardly, had any information. I'm not even talking about understanding at this point. I'm just like having the right information. You went to see a physician once a year, or maybe on occasions when something acute happens. And in 5 to 10 minutes, you get a piece of information. You have to do it with that. I mean, there was no other information to go back to. Maybe some brochures, but very, very little information was available. Now, since Dr. Google, that radically changed. And I think we should not forget that in the end, and this is the basic idea behind healthusiasm, in my opinion, is that everybody wants to be healthy and happy. It's the most important thing that we all have. So the fact that people are looking for information that helps them, that maybe confirms some of their, thoughts, is actually super important. And that is what we've seen in the 25 years. This huge interest in information related to health. Now, that doesn't mean that now that it's more equally distributed, that they understand everything, and that they understand the value of science. The question is, will that change now with AI? Will, instead of distributing information, we will now distribute knowledge. And what will then be the result of it, of course? And I think what we will see in the next 5 to 10 years is an equally distributed health knowledge. Now, assuming that the information that comes out of AI is the right information and the right knowledge that is generated, and people can actually do something with it. But we are entering what I often call the post-knowledge world, where we used to structure our society, our value in society, even based on the knowledge that we possess or don't possess. With AI, we might come into a situation, a world, a society where knowledge is no longer power, because it will be, or it could be, equally distributed. And I think that will radically change this whole disinformation, information thing, or misinformation thing that we're having, if AI is properly done right. The question is, how will that happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, it'd be nice to think that would be the case, and let's all hope that we move towards that. As you were talking, I was thinking, humanity has been through, paradigm shifts like this several times, and actually the move away from religion and religious faith, actually, and the sort of Enlightenment was maybe a good example of this. Our faith and trust, our literal faith, of the source of truth was in a higher power, and then the humans within that would like mediate that, and through that came power. And then with that, we then after that had science coming in as a mechanism by which you try and extract objective truths from this and work out what is and isn't correct, and distribute that. And then we sort of settle down and think, oh, this is fine, we've now sorted it. But of course we haven't. And now we're moving through another, maybe a phase shift. So what comes next, we're not sure about. I think the interesting thing about AI, and we saw this in the last couple of weeks, so we're recording right at the end of January, and DeepSeek, what happened with DeepSeek actually threw the cat amongst the pigeons on this one, because the received wisdom was like, the more money you spend, the more compute you throw, the more data you harvest, the smarter the model you build. And that means that it's a big person's game. It's like America, Project Stargate, 500 billion on infrastructure and everything like that. And then DeepSeek, a model that is very, very, has good performance, at least as good as the rest of them, and that's being tested out just now, but done at a fraction of the cost, allegedly. It does appear to have been done in a more efficient way, coming out from not the US, but China, of all places, and they've worked very hard to restrict the tools that would be needed for this. All of a sudden said, well, is this right? Now, coming back to why I've mentioned this, whoever builds the AI, whoever selects what data goes into it, whoever aligns the model determines what that model will then say, what truth comes out of it, whether it hallucinates or not. And you saw examples of this with people asking DeepSeek about things like Tiananmen Square, about Taiwan, and coming out with perspectives that were more closely aligned with the China perspective. And people thinking, well, this is terrible. It's not unique. You try asking some questions to ChatGPT about things that would make the US position uncomfortable, you get the same side of things. So AI will have a part to play in terms of democratizing access to a breadth of information, but there are still people controlling what perspectives are going to be in that. And that's going to be interesting.
And I think it's super, super important that this will be done right, because we talked about online searches, we talked about social media, now we're talking about AI. If you look at the number of online searches related to health, there are about 1 billion per day, health-related queries on Google. If you look at the number of people who interact with social media accounts that are healthfluencers or medfluencers, it's about 93% of the people online on social media. 40% of them say, we change our behavior. Even if we are a chronic patient, we will change our behavior based on what we see there. Now, you can expect the same or even more interest in what AI can provide and help you with your health. Because I think we talked about science before and the value that science brings, and science needs to reinvent itself. I think what we notice is that people more and more, because the information is more equally distributed, because knowledge will be more equally distributed, is that we will see people looking for not just the average clinical study, because they don't care about the average clinical study. What about 16,000 people and the average says this or that? I'm not average. I'm a single human being with specific characteristics, and they will look for specific answers for them. I always call that personal science. People will try to experiment with all the data and the Excel and the wearables and the tools that they have available, but also with AI to see what really matters and helps for their specific health situation. We're moving into that personal science era where AI will play a huge role. So I think everything that we've seen with online and social, which were already magnificent, enormous numbers, will even be surpassed by everything that AI will provide related to health.
Yeah, I think there is a tier level where that works, and there's a level where it won't work anymore. So I think people say, what is a good supplement for me? Right. And that depends on who you are and what markers you have. So for instance, if you would have a diagnosis of your blood and you give that to the AI might be able to service you in things where you can provide that service to yourself. But if you would go into a really edgy cancer treatment, the system is not equipped to provide
not
you
yet.
with that.
It's a matter of time.
Yeah.
Well, it's a matter of money. It's not a matter of time. It's a matter of money and resources. Yeah. So I think there's a tier where that might work. And there's a tier where I think in the transition, it will create a lot of frustration and will hinder a lot of the basic services, which are not equipped to service that. I think it will put a lot of stress on that. And then maybe it's the Overton window, and maybe it will shift, the way we serve people suffering from cancer. But in the transition is going to be really messy.
Yeah. It's just speaking to you this morning has got me thinking, again, going back to, it's interesting even just hearing you speak just now about, that we are able to use the technology that we have to deliver something that is objectively true in a better way to many people as well. But at the same time, when a person comes to me as a doctor and they say, I'd like you to test my thyroid, right? Because, I think there's something wrong with my thyroid. What's more interesting than actually is their thyroid over or underactive is what is it? What is getting a thyroid test, in their mind, the solution to? What is the underlying problem? Why have they come to this bit as well? And of course, that doesn't just naturally come from, I am tired, thyroid being underactive makes me tired, and there you go. Are they having problems at home? Are they unhappy at work? Is there anything else, like something that they're feeling and thinking and experiencing crystallizes into, this is what the solution might be. And as doctors, as we become more transactional, it gets easier for us to just say, well, you want that, here you go. So yes, again, coming back to why has that happened? What is the emotional determinant of why they've come in? What is the context? Where has this come from? Helps you, yes, maybe get a thyroid test, but also dig into it. And in time-pressured situations when demand is very high, our ability to spend time speaking to people and thinking and connecting, just as you said, Mo, as you said, Christophe, about this, boils that out. It goes everywhere, and it's misinformation or anything like that. But underneath it, it's, what's the human drive to this?
Yeah, I think we saw this happening a lot. I think the whole misinformation, disinformation thing, we saw a peak during COVID. We talked briefly about it. The question is, how do we solve it? I recently came across a research by the Joint Research Center by the EU, who was looking into misinformation related to health. And they were really looking into what are our findings related to COVID-19 misinformation or even disinformation. Now, it started off by just saying misinformation goes beyond health topics, obviously. Second key finding was certain groups are more vulnerable, obviously. Nothing new there. You don't need to do 3-4 years of research to come to that conclusion. But what annoyed me even more is that they came with 3 strategies to combat misinformation. And the thing was, and maybe I haven't looked deeply enough on their website, but their strategies were extremely superficial and non-helpful, in a sense that we knew this before. I don't know how many millions that might have cost that research, but the things that they say, we need to do pre-bunking. So before the exposure, we need to educate people on misinformation. Okay. We need to do during exposure, we need to do some nudging so that they are looking at things in a more critical way. And that perhaps we need to put in place some things to prioritize factual information. Obvious. And then after exposure, we need to debunk things, making sure that misinformation is not spread. And while reading that report, I was really about, how is this possible? And I started looking, because there's nothing in there. I mean, this is things that we know. And I started looking everywhere to find other articles on how can we potentially solve this. And the only thing that you always see coming back is we need to install trusts. People need to be critical about what you read and so forth. So my question to you is, I mean, this is becoming a huge problem. We saw it happening in the online space. We see it happening in the social space. It will be even bigger in the AI space. In America, it's exploding right now, probably for the obvious reasons we mentioned earlier. So what could be potential solutions? I don't know if it's an easy answer, but I mean, I think we need to tackle some of those here right now.
Well, you are saying, it's strange that there are some actions. I think there's some correlations that are interesting. It seems that one's trust in the healthcare system correlates with the trust in politics. So if it's an unethical, the behaviors and the attitudes we see in politics make us distrust the healthcare system. So the trust in a government correlates, or the distrust in the government correlates with the distrust in the healthcare system at large. So I think we're also looking at information, but we're also looking at attitudes that feed distrust, because what you're saying is people are confused and there's distrust. So I think are we equipped, or do we need to process? I love the fact that we're empowered in our health decisions, but the question is, are we equipped? And should it, to which extent do we have to do that because we don't trust the system? So I think maybe it's not a choice to be empowered to have our own decision making, but maybe the need for own decision making comes from the fact that we're confused because we feel a distrust toward the system, that we think they don't act in our interest. So I think that's the underlying.
What's the solution?
Well,
I think,
so.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, go on, Mark.
No, go ahead, Keith.
Well, we'll come on to solutions in a moment, but one thing I think is really, really important is there are reasons why we got to where we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is how we were before. What you were talking about, Christophe, is essentially how do we get back to the way we were before? As in, these are just, like the way we did it before was, this is what I heard is like, in some ways, it worked before, it's drifted back. These are ways to take us back to how it worked before in some form. My thought
Well, I'm not
is
another
that,
person that wants to go back. I want to move forward
no,
and
I
have a
know,
better situation, right? So,
sure,
okay.
and I'm not suggesting that that's what you're saying here either. But I'm like you, I think what they suggested is kind of obvious and everything. But ultimately, what they're kind of saying is like, how do we get back to that nice time when everything worked? And these are new ways of getting back to it. My feeling is we shouldn't go back at all, because part of what happened before led us here, and we have changed, and so we have to think about what are we trying to do and how do we adapt to this new world. That is the kind of point I want to say here. And then in terms of solutions for that, there's a few things that I might mention in a moment, and part of it is about trying to maintain critical thinking. Whether the right way to do that is to just double down on education and so on in a world of AI,
I think so too.
But it's difficult to say. In terms of literal ways of doing so, there are ways of trying to improve that trust balance. And so, for example, I see what YouTube are doing with YouTube Health. People are going to YouTube, and YouTube Health tries to set a situation where they can essentially kite mark or verify that this is a trusted source. Problem being that, Mo, you're already saying that people don't trust trusted sources anymore, actually acts against you. Or seeing medical influencers using the tools of the influencer economy and the ways of telling stories, and then within that weaving in more consistent health messages. I think it's more about that. One of the ones that I did like is there was a really interesting paper that I saw, and Ethan Mollick shared it again recently, was a study which showed how a large language model can be very successful at de-radicalizing people from conspiracy theories. I don't know if you saw that, but they basically did a trial with GPT-4 and some simple prompting, and they got people who had firm beliefs in conspiracy theories to converse with a large language model. And they found that those people, after these sessions, had an average of a 20% reduction in their level of belief in these conspiracy theories. Not only that, it reduced their belief in other conspiracy theories, and that persisted for months. So interestingly, AI may have a role in helping educate. I was going to say the wrong word. Well, I was going to say correct people's thinking. That's absolutely not the right way to say this, but helping people engage in that kind of reasoned debate without it being polarized. So I think that's a really interesting way forward. And I can share the details. We can maybe share it with the notes, but there's some hints there, I think.
I just want to address a very important thing. I think the attitude of Christophe, what is the solution? My ego would drive me to give solutions and not acknowledge how complex the problem is. And we find ourselves pushed by what is the solution. And the fact that I'm on a podcast doesn't mean that I'm an expert panel member, but I'm not an expert in these things. And humility would tell me, I would need to look into that. I don't know. But we often don't do that. Our ego says we have to say something. We have to, the only thing, what I loved about Keith is what would help, right? And what I love about DeepSeek, if you put it in R1 mode, is that it shows how it reasons.
Reasoning.
And I think we might go from a knowledge society to a reasoning society, because reasoning equips you in all situations. And I love the way, and I know people will shortcut that, and nobody would look at the reasoning of R1 and just look at the output. But I think that's a positive evolution, and that would help if we might change, for instance, the priority is, do you understand the reasoning? And then I'll show you why the answer is linked to the reasoning. And I think that's a positive evolution. We are in health enthusiasm, right? And I think technology might help us reason. And reasoning gives you a skill that is independent of whether it is health or things like that. And that's why, sorry again, I'm old school. I went to the humaniora, right? And there were debating classes, right? And you could take any stance as long as you could justify it. And our teacher says, take whatever stance, but defend it and make it sound good because there's a reasoning behind it. So first of all, I don't know, which I think is humility. Second, I think it's too complex for me to know. I don't have the expertise. But third, I think, in getting inspiration from what Keith said, what would help is that technology would not only give us answers, but also accompany us through the reasoning behind it. Yeah.
May I just say just one thing about the reasoning? I'm in agreement with you on this. It is a very important point to make that when these models are reasoning, they are not reasoning like humans reason. Remember, how these models work is that reasoning chain is a probabilistic description of what the reasoning towards the outcome would be. Now, it's a very, very, this isn't how it is reasoning, but that impression, that simulation of a reasoned argument actually kind of has the same end result. But it is very, very important, as I understand how the models work, that it isn't reasoning like humans reason. It is predicting what a human-like reasoning chain would look like. Now, the end result is still very valuable. And actually, if we come away with a greater appreciation of our own reasoning processes, that's really good if it gets more accurate. But this is the other area as we enter into this world of AI. It is not thinking like we are. It is this. And I know there's a lot of debate in that, but this is actually
AGI might change that though. So we're 1-2 years away from AGI. That might change that, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, my position on this is that it will look very much like that, but it will not be how we do it. It will still be very useful, and that's maybe another topic for another time.
Yeah, but imagine someone takes a stance, you don't understand it, and instead of saying you're wrong, you could say, explain your reasoning behind it. Help me understand why you come to that. And that, I think, is some interesting attitude.
I love that thought. It's a bit unusual, but I think it's very valuable. And I'll have this afternoon to think about this reasoning, what do you call it, society. I think it's
debating things, yeah.
Debating things. I think it's very, very valuable. Now let's move to the unusual ones. It was a really unusual answer. I really loved it, but let's move to the unusual ones to finish off this podcast maybe. And I'll start with you, No, I'll start with Mo. You were in a good flow. Let's stick with what you
Mo is in a flow.
Had in mind. The Mo flow.
Mo flow.
We talked about the attention economy in our podcast. We also talked about the inattention economy in the podcasts. But what is the intention economy? Don't leave too much of a white space.
You know what? I don't know.
Okay.
Well done. Very on theme.
There you go.
Shall I give it a go then? Shall I try and fill out that? Okay, I'll put it out there. So the intention economy must be about the kind of marketplace of driving people towards certain outcomes. So if the attention economy is about grabbing people's attention and their time, I'm not entirely sure what the inattention economy would be, but I'm thinking it's the obverse. So the intention economy must be about building tools or apparatus to drive a person's direction, their behaviors towards something in particular.
Yeah, exactly. So just to be clear, the attention economy is really to grab your attention. The inattention economy was the desire for people to not be notified and disturbed all the time. And this is something that we see with silent trains, silent cabs, and all those things. So that's the opposite. And the intention economy is indeed that the fact that AI will more and more take decisions for us. It's becoming more and more powerful. And definitely with agentic AI, what we will see. So agentic AI is where AI actually works as an agent for you and can do a lot of things like book your flights, manage your tasks, or even entirely, plan your trip, including the hotels, the trips you want to do during that stay, etc. So you really lay everything in the hands of that AI. And apparently the intention economy is related to the fact that more and more companies will no longer just battle to have your attention, but will battle to make sure that you trust that AI to take the decisions for you.
I was thinking, it sounds to me like the autonomy economy, I think, is, it's like we cede our agency and autonomy to someone else. Intentional autonomy. I think that you've got me thinking now, Christophe.
It's incredible how these economies also sequence each other in a very high
Speed.
Rhythm. 1963, Herbert Simon pinpoint the expression, the attention economy. He says when there's an overload of information, there's a scarcity of attention. But now I think from everything you are saying with generative AI and AGI being able to produce unlimited content, I think we will go into a trust or a distrust economy. I think that will be the main driver. There's no shortage of content. There's no shortage of providers. Like Elon Musk say, if everyone is going to be an entrepreneur, who do I buy from in all trust and safety? And who do I listen to in all trust and safety? So I think after the attention economy and the exponential production of content, we'll go into a trust and a distrust economy.
Nice. Going to the next unusual one for you, Keith. Maybe you've heard of it. What is the Flynn effect? It is written as Flynn. Flynn.
Okay. All right. Okay. I don't know, but let me just have a guess. I think it might relate to Errol Flynn. And Errol Flynn was an actor from the kind of silent era, and he was a sort of heartthrob. And so, but then when the silent era ended, and people could hear him, he didn't have a voice. He looked tremendous on silent cat film. But then, when they heard his voice, the mystique went. So I think it's something related to that. That's my guess.
No, it's wrong. But it's a cool guess. I wasn't aware of that anecdote. So
yeah, Errol Flynn, Robin Hood, I think it was one of his major roles. I was also thinking of Flynn. Yeah,
it's James Flynn.
Okay.
And so it's a study that James Flynn is a researcher from the 80s. And so what he did notice or observed in his research was that there is an increase in average IQ scores over generations. So basically, every decade there's 3 points on the IQ scores that goes up. That's basically the idea. Mainly related to the fact that people are getting better at problem solving, abstract thinking, pattern recognition, and those kind of things. And it's seen across the board, across multiple countries. Now, more recently, studies in Norway, Denmark, the UK even, Keith, we've noticed that the Flynn effect is slowing down or even reversing. So we see that the IQ scores are going down right now. And that's according to the study, and I need to be sure that I don't do any misinformation or disinformation here. But the assumptions are that it's related to the changes in education system, the fact that people are more on social media, etc., and do less of deep thinking. They play more video games. They don't do debating, as Mo was already saying as well. But also the fact that, family sizes are smaller. You were talking about discussions in the family. So the family sizes are smaller. People are more distracted. Parents are more distracted. People play less outside. Individualistic society, but the identity, as you were mentioning as well, less social interactions. The obesity rates. Apparently, there are studies that relate poor diets and sedentary lifetimes to reduce IQ gains as well. Pollution, all of these things. Basically, the whole world, the way that we live in today, is having a negative impact on the IQ gains that we used to have.
Well, maybe a nuance. IQ and intelligence are not necessarily related. IQ was mainly developed in an academic framework. And it's true that we are developing a new sort of intelligence today, not only artificial, but also human. We are inventing the way we are intelligent. And it's often, I think we'll see the end where IQ and performance and success will not be related anymore. So I think as education shifts and morphs, the IQ will become less and less relevant because the IQ was mainly designed for an academic setting. And I think as I discussed in our Valentine's thing, there is a shift in intelligence. And I think that might become obsolete, that IQ.
Yeah. And you said it best. That's exactly it. I think, what does IQ measure that might have changed about how we think about intelligence? I was thinking about how we measure intelligence of AI, and it was that same point. It's like the measures that we use, the humans, can easily be spoofed by AI. So what is intelligence? I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
That's
a
another
debate
podcast.
for next time, I think. Nice having talked to you and discussed with you about disinformation and misinformation. I hope you liked the show. Thank you for listening, everyone. If you like this show, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform, because every 1 or 2 weeks, we are releasing great content. So we believe, at least, with some interesting information and as least as possible dis and misinformation. You can also visit healthusiasm.com to discover the other episodes, subscribe to the newsletter, or learn more about our panelists. For now, I'd like to thank our panelists for their healthusiasm. Thank you, Dr. Keith Grimes and Mo Zouina. My name is Christophe Jauquet. We are the Healthusiasm panel. And before I end, I already have to cough. But we'd love to see you again next week for some more healthusiasm. Ciao.